Frau Präsidentin, sehr geehrte
President, ladies and gentlemen, members. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today on Europe Day in this special place. Your invitation honours and touches me. I'm honoured because you are the freely elected members of the European Parliament and you represent 450 million Europeans, the citizens of Europe. And I'm touched because the 9th of May is the appropriate forward-looking response to the world war unleashed by Germany, the response to destructive nationalism and imperialistic megalomania. Today, 73 years ago, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed creating an organised and living Europe. At the start, we had the pooling of coal and steel, so those goods that for decades had been used to manufacture weapons which our grandfathers and great-grandfathers had used to shoot at each other. The dream of the fathers and mothers of Europe was to end this murderous cycle for once and for all. And this is a dream that has been fulfilled for us. War between our peoples has become unimaginable. And that's thanks to the European Union, and that's something that benefits us all. But looking in the direct neighbourhood of the European Union shows us a terrible reality, which is that this dream is not a reality in all the countries of Europe. With great sacrifice, people in Ukraine defend on a daily basis their freedom and democracy, their sovereignty and their independence against a brutal Russian army of invasion, and we support them in that. The founding fathers and mothers assigned the growing Europe an important task, which went far further than just internal peace. For them, Europe had a clear responsibility for global affairs. The well-being of Europe cannot be separated from the well-being of the rest of the world. To quote the Schuman Declaration, this production, coal and steel, will be offered to the world as a whole without distinction or exception, with the aim of contributing to raising living standards and promoting peaceful achievements. With increased resources, Europe will be able to pursue the achievement of one of its essential tasks, namely the development of the African continent. Back then, the development of the African continent stood in contrast to the mainly Europe-led colonial exploitation of our neighbouring continent. Even back then, overcoming the consequences of colonialism was an essential feature of Europe's partnership with the countries of Africa, Asia and Latin America. A partnership that left behind the Eurocentric vision of previous decades. And that not only calls for, but establishes equal terms between us as partners. And establishing these partnerships seems to me more important than ever today. 450 and perhaps following the next enlargement, perhaps 500 million citizens live in the EU. That's around 5% of the global population. New economic, demographic and political heavyweights are appearing in Asia, Africa and South America, a result of the distribution of labour between countries and continents, which have raised 1 billion people out of poverty. And they quite rightly won't be satisfied with a bi- or tripolar world order. And therefore, I firmly believe that the world of the 21st century will be multipolar. It has been for a long time already. But what does that mean for us in Europe? To quote the French author Paul Valéry, will Europe be what it actually is, a small promontory, a headland of the Asian continent? And we can't find the answer to that question by looking back. Those who are nostalgic for European great power status, fantasies which remain among some people, they're stuck in the past, as are those who warn constantly of Europe's decline. They can't win the challenges of the future. They underestimate one thing, Europe's ability to change and to act. And that's something that we've shown again and again in the crisis of recent years and of the present. Let's just think about how we together, in a supportive manner, came through last winter. I think the three lessons to emerge from that are as follows. Firstly, Europe's future is in our hands. Secondly, the more united we stand, the easier it is to ensure a good future. And thirdly, not less, rather more openness and more cooperation are the watchwords of our time. We need to ensure Europe an appropriate place in the world of tomorrow, a place that is not greater or lesser than that of other countries and regions, but on an equal footing with others, side by side. And in order to do that, the European Union needs to change. We need a geopolitical EU, an enlarged and reformed EU, and last but not least, an EU that is open to the future. I see the European Parliament as a driving force for all of those, and also an ally. Let's look at the creation of a geopolitical Europe, for example. Here, 50 years ago, Willy Brandt talked about this as an existential need. He wrote, "A united Europe isn't only a question of the quality of our existence, it's a question of survival between giants in a world divided between old and new nationalisms." The European Parliament has always acted in accordance with this maxim, and I'm very grateful to you for that. You act along those lines when you uphold the primacy of the law, and when you recall that Europe can only be listened to when it speaks with one voice. Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine has shown us all how essential this is. And as a logical consequence, the European Union has rarely been more united than in standing up to this violation of European and the international order. So let's base a geopolitical Europe on this experience. I made some proposals as to how that should happen at the Charles University in Prague last summer. We need closer links between our efforts at defence and the establishment of an integrated European defence economy, the European Peace Facility, joint procurement of ammunition for Ukraine, closer cooperation between our countries on air defence, our strategic compass, and close cooperation between NATO and the EU. All these are approaches that we want to deepen and speed up. We now have to look to the reconstruction of Ukraine as well. That will require political and financial capital over the long term. But there is a major opportunity there, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole, because a prosperous, democratic, European Ukraine is the clearest possible rejection there can be to Putin's imperial, revisionist and illegal policy on our continent. We also need to compete with other great powers. The United States remains Europe's most important ally. When we invest more in our security and defence, civilian resilience, technological sovereignty, reliable supply chains, in our independence when it comes to critical raw materials, well, those investments make us better allies for our transatlantic friends. Our relationship with China can be described as competitor, systemic partners, competitor and systemic rival. And rivalry and competitiveness on the side of China have certainly increased. The EU has seen this and is reacting. I agree with Ursula von der Leyen when she says no decoupling, but a smart de-risking is the way to go. The countries of the global south are new partners, and we need to take their concerns and interests seriously, and that's why it's so important that Europe works supportively and decisively for food security and to fight poverty, we also need to keep the promises that we made at international climate and environment conferences. That also belongs to a geopolitical Europe. We need to rapidly conclude new free trade agreements with Mercosur, Mexico, India, Indonesia, Australia, Kenya, and also in the future with many other countries.
Faire Abkommen, die die wirtschaftliche Entwicklung
Fair agreements that support our partners' economic developments rather than hindering it. They need to be fair. And that means, for example, that the initial processing of raw materials needs to take place in situ rather than in China or elsewhere. If we anchor these thoughts in our trade relations, then we can make a major contribution to diversifying our supply chains. Europe must turn to the rest of the world. If we continue to negotiate fruitlessly for years on new free trade agreements, then in the future it will be others who dictate the rules with lower environmental and social standards. A key decision over the shape of a geopolitical Europe was taken last year, and the European Parliament was a driving force there as well. We have decided to go for a larger Europe. We have said to the citizens of the West Balkan states, Ukraine, Moldova, and potentially also Georgia, you belong to us.
Wir möchten, dass
We want you to become part of the European Union. And this isn't just about altruism. This is about our credibility and good economic sense. And it's also about securing peace in Europe, subsequent to the watershed moment that was Russia's attack on Ukraine. A geopolitical Europe must keep its promises to its neighbours. An honest enlargement policy sticks to its promises, first and foremost, those made to the states of the West Balkans, to whom we've been promising accession for 20 years. Obviously, the normalisation process between Serbia and Kosovo and reforms in accession countries must be continued. Obviously, more rapid progress towards accession must follow North Macedonia's courage as well.
solche Fortschritte müssen dann
These steps forward need to be appreciated and honoured on our side, because otherwise the enlargement policy uses its ability to act as an incentive and the EU loses influence and attraction. Honesty means an enlarged EU needs to be a reformed EU. Obviously, enlargement shouldn't be the only reason for reforms, but it should be an arrival point. And I expressly welcome the fact that the European Parliament is working on proposals for institutional reforms, even on proposals that don't spare the Parliament itself. And I will continue to call on the Council to discuss these ideas. Now, many things, or some things, are obvious. More Council decisions through qualified majorities, for example, in foreign policy and on taxation.
Dafür werde ich weiter
And I will continue to make efforts at persuasion. And I'm very grateful for the wide support I'm receiving from the Parliament. I would say to sceptics, it's not unanimity, it's not 100% agreement on all decisions that creates democratic legitimacy. Quite the opposite. It's efforts to get majorities, negotiations for alliances that mark us out as democrats, the search for compromises, which are also in the interests of minorities. That reflects our understanding of liberal democracy. I think we need to ensure that we stick to democratic principles and the rule of law within the EU as well. And I know that the vast majority of you are on my side here as well. So why don't we use the current discussion on reforming the EU to strengthen the Commission and ensure that it can introduce infringement proceedings when our basic values are violated, our basic values such as freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law and guarantees of human rights.
Meine Damen und Herren, noch.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's something else which I've just mentioned, which is important. As Europeans, we need to open up to the future without ifs or buts. That means dealing with problems that have beset us for years. We need to ensure that other countries can't split us and play us off against one another. And here I'm thinking, for example, about the way we deal with migration. Now, obviously, we need a solution that's in line with the European claim to solidarity. But we can't wait until this solidarity appears to us like the Holy Ghost. As Robert Schuman said 73 years ago, Europe is made through concrete achievements, through de facto solidarity. And I would therefore urgently call on us to conclude on the joint European asylum system reform. We've taken steps forward in Council after long and difficult negotiations, and let's do that before the European elections. Your agreement on a negotiating position was an important part, on important parts of this reform last month, was an important step along this path. So we need to conclude this work. We agree on the goal that we need to better manage migration without betraying our values. But there is something that we could do better than we have done so far. In many parts of Europe, we urgently need workers, also from third countries. Now, if we link opportunities for legal migration with the requirement for transit countries and countries of origin to take back those who have no right to remain, well, then all sides will benefit. Also, we need to ensure the effective protection of our external borders, as we agreed in the European Council meeting in February. That would increase the acceptance of smart, managed and controlled migration to our countries. And then we would take the bedrock away from those who do politics on the basis of fear and resentment. Opening up to the future means that we also need to deal with the most important tasks that we face. And here I'm talking about our countries, economies and societies' moves into a climate-neutral future. The first industrial revolution started in Europe. And it should be our claim that the second industrial revolution also takes place here to the benefit of everyone. I don't need to explain to you the opportunity that we have here. And it's important for the citizens of our countries to also feel that as part of their daily lives. With cheaper electricity, for example, made from renewable energies, so that we've got charging stations for electric cars and lorries right across Europe, so that we have future-oriented jobs in the energy sector or in the chips industry, because the entire world will need the technology for climate neutrality. We need to shape this change in an ambitious manner and not leave anyone behind. That is the large project that we need to look to as Europeans now.
Es mit Oscar Wilde
To quote Oscar Wilde, the future belongs to those who recognise opportunities before they become obvious. Now, this is not something for nostalgics, and it's certainly not something for revisionists who dream of international greatness or imperial power.
Die Ukrainerinnen und Ukrainer zahlen mit ihrem
Ukrainians are paying with their lives for this delusion on the part of their powerful neighbour. 2,200 kilometres northeast from here, in Moscow, Putin is parading his soldiers, tanks and artillery. Let's not be intimidated. let's stand firm in our support for Ukraine as long as is necessary. I don't think any of us wants to go back to a time when the law of the jungle reigned in Europe, when small countries had to bow to large countries, when freedom was a privilege of the few rather than a fundamental right for everyone. Our European Union, united in its diversity, is the best insurance that we have to ensure that this past does not return. And that's why the message of the 9th of May is not what's coming from Moscow today. The message is ours, and it is that the past will not triumph over the future. The future, our future, is the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vielen Dank. Thank you very much, Chancellor Scholz. Thank you very much, Chancellor Scholz, for that inspiring speech.